Good morning, all of you. My name is Bhatia, and this is a class of. We are going to start our new subject, BHIE 141. As this, you all know about the historical perspective of China, how China introduced in the economy of that particular time, how the historical evolution of China, and what was the changing of China in the future, and what was the dynasty were ruling over there. The dynasty which was known as the King Dynasty. Okay, this was ruling over there. And what was the condition of China beyond the world in 18th and 19th century? This is we are going to start about the history of China. In this unit, we are going to cover some important points, just like the ways in which our understanding of China's history and the sum of main landmarks and trends in Chinese history. And the third one is the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty to rule over China. And next is the nature of China's relation with the rest of world before mid 19th century. Now, in this unit, we are going to start with the introduction, just like we are going to start about the history of China between 1840 to 1978. This is the time period of this BHIE 141, 1840 to 1971. China is one of the oldest civilizations and polities with a continuous existence in the world. It follows that its more recent history can be understood only in the context of its long and eventful history over several millennia. As you go through the course on China from 1840 to 1978, some of the questions that may occur to you that are what was the nature of Chinese economy and how did such a vast and powerful polity was run over there? And next one is how did a country that was repeatedly defeated and humiliated by foreign powers from the mid 19th century and what was the condition of that particular area? Next is we are going to cover some important point, that is changing understanding of China, how we are going to understand about China, because before starting to know about the dynasty in China, to know about the social political economy of China, we need to know about some important, just like introduction of the history of China. By the assault on China by the West was historically inevitable. Next is why China failed to adequately respond to the West and modernize itself. The result of this was the Western scholarship on China for a long time emphasized the insular and rigid nature of traditional Chinese society and Chinese government, which it said came in the way of China, opening itself to the outside world and undertaking reforms to face the challenges of modern era. In addition, Western narratives put forward the concept of Sinocentrism. According to this notion, the Chinese believed that they were the center of the world, and hence looked down on other peoples and countries. They were unwilling to unprepared to learn from other countries and engage with world order based on the concept of equal and sovereign nation states. Another change in the perspective that is of concern is when to place the beginning of modern China. Many courses on modern Chinese history, including this one, began with the Opium Wars in mid 19th century. Opium War, we will discuss about this when it comes in your syllabus. Next, the notion that China and the Chinese were contemporaries of non Chinese people and sought to isolate themselves from the outside world. This has been discredited. In the course of its long civilization, China has absorbed influences from many directions, and even been profoundly transferred by them. Next, how the historical evolution of China. We are going to discuss about the historical evolution. The area which constitutes today's China in eastern end of Eurasian landmass is a territory of continental size and variety. It includes the fertile plains along two major west-east river systems, the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, and many other waterways along coastal belt that is very narrow and hilly, particularly in the southern part. The thickly forested hills of south, southwest, and high Tibetan plateau, and the Himalayan range further west, southwest, a vast and arid desert region in the far west and northwest, and temperature forested zone bordering Siberia and northeast. These were the geographical condition of China, how China run over there, geographical condition. Towards the end of second millennium BCE, the Shang rulers were defeated by those who founded the Zhou dynasty, the longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history, which ended only in 3rd century BCE. The Zhou is the first dynasty for which there are literary records. It is a period when the foundations of the most classical schools of thought of China were laid. Moreover, the use of iron led to a great increase in agricultural productivity and wealth and more powerful military weapons. Next, we are going to know about the evolution of Chinese thought and the impact of Buddhism. Yes, the religion which exists in China, that was Buddhism, connected to Mahavir, no, connected to Gautam Buddha. The increase in wealth and the rise of new technologies under the Zhou, coupled with the growing warfare and breakdown of order in the later part of this period, led to social and intellectual ferment and the appearance of the so called hundred schools of thought. Various philosophers and thinkers tried to make sense of rapid changes taking place around them. Means we are going to discuss about the evolution of Chinese thought, how the Chinese thinkers had evoluted some important things, and how they shown the main religion that was known as Buddhism at that time. Certainly, the most famous and most influential among them was Confucius. Confucius, born in 550 BCE and known in Chinese as the Master Kong and Confuzi. Confucius deplored the breakdown of order which he saw and ascribed it to moral decay. He urged a return to what he considered the golden days when relationships and mutual obligations among people were respected, such as those between the ruler and the ruled, between father and the son, and other family relations. But more significantly, he believed that order and prosperity would be restored only if truly moral man of talent governed the land. Confucius believed that the qualities required of such men did not depend on birth, but on education and merit based. The primacy given to merit acquired through education, the notion of government by virtue rather than government based on divine right are distinctive features of Confucius or philosophy. Confucius was a teacher and advisor to the local ruler of that particular area, and his sayings were collected after his lifetime by his disciples and made into a compilation known as an Analects. His was a social, political, ethical philosophy rather than a religion as such, but he exercised a greater and more lasting influence of Chinese society. than perhaps any other individual and has been venerated almost like a god. Roughly around the same period that Confucius expounded his teachings, another very different philosophy arose known as Taoism. Its ideas are ascribed to Lao Tzu, and its foundational text is called Tao Te Ching. In marked contrast to the Confucius emphasize on social order, social structure, governance. Taoism held that man needed to live in tune with the natural order of things or the Tao. Tao means usually translated as the way. Taoism was a mystical philosophy that valued spontaneity and intuition, as opposed to the direct, moralistic, and didactic tone of Confucian texts. Taoist works often spoke in riddles and parables. One feature that the Confucian and Taoist philosophies had in common was that they were not very concerned about God or life after death. This element was introduced into Chinese belief system by Buddhism, which entered China mainly from around the 3rd century CE. The first couple of centuries in which Buddhism began to gain many followers in China was again a period of social and political confusion in China, following the breakup of the unified empire and the invasion of North China by various nomadic peoples. It is possible that these conditions led many people to question the meaning of life and the possibility of an individual leading a righteous life when conditions around them were so chaotic. Buddhism provided answers to some of these questions. The form of Buddhism that became dominant in China was Mahayana Buddhism. The second part of Buddhism, Hinayana and Mahayana, and in Hinayana and Mahayana, the Mahayana Buddhism were dominant in China. Its colorful rituals and miners did it colorful rituals and fables and practice of veneration of Buddha and bodhisattvas and minor deities added richness and new dimension to Chinese spiritual life. The Buddhist Sangha monastic order carried out welfare measures, which also helped it to gain adherents for Buddhism at a time when the imperial order had collapsed. Overall, the Chinese belief system was a complex amalgam of different and often contrasting philosophies and practices. In contrast to the situation in many other countries, in China, for the most part, these different schools were not seen as being mutually exclusive. Next, we are going to cover that point is known as the Chinese imperial state and the challenge from the steppe. Because the steppe area were run over there, that exists over there. That's why we are going to discuss about with the steppe and what was the condition of the imperial state in China. Under the first emperor, who was the first emperor? Qin Shi Huangdi. That is a very different name, Qin Shi Huangdi. The empire was for the first time divided into provinces, which were centrally administered. First of all, we are going to discuss about the empire, the condition of empire, and how the empire was made at that time. Yes, in 221 BCE, the the administration was run by Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 BCE. That was the major landmark in Chinese history. Thereafter, the Chinese empire went through many modifications and even broke up into separate contending states in certain periods. And what was the condition of that empire at that time? A uniform legal code and the uniform script was enforced. He turned the peasants into freeholders who had to pay taxes directly to the same. Trunk road connected the different parts of the empire, were built, and weights and measures were standardized. Cheongdi was most famous for connecting up, strengthening the different walls built by the former states into what he know today as the Great Wall of China to keep nomadic peoples to the north and west from raiding or invading his empire. The amazing thing is that this basic frame of Chinese empire, which lasted right until the 20th century, was built in less than a couple of decades before King Xiaodin did. His dynasty was toppled shortly after in the first recorded instance of many peasant rebellions in Chinese history. However, the structure and feature of Chinese empire were modified considerably over subsequent centuries. The ideology of the state was tempered with Confucian notion of rule by virtue rather than the first emperor emphasis on strict laws and harsh punishment. The greatest challenge to Chinese empire from its earliest days was the presence of warlike nomadic peoples on its northern and northwestern parts of that area. The riches of China, based on its development agricultural economy, were a source of great attraction of nomadic people. That's why nomadic people, especially Genghis Khan's nomadic people, they wanted to enter into China. And from these type of Sikhs, the ruler of China had made that time the Great Wall of China, just to not to make them enter into China at that time. Yes, that time the tribal people were very much the tribal people or nomadic people were very much a great danger for the people of Chinese at that time. That's why they made the Great Wall of China. That is also known as today the Great Wall of China. Starting from the period of disunion following the collapse of Han Empire in 3rd century CE. Nomadic tribes repeatedly invade China and even managed to establish their rule over parts of northern China. It was only the Mongols under Kublai Khan in 13th century who managed to establish the rule of ethically non-Chinese people over the whole of Chinese empire for the first time. From centuries later, their feat was repeated when the people called Manchus from the region northeast of Great Wall invaded and established their own rule, that of King dynasty, the last dynasty to rule over the Chinese empire, that was King dynasty. The remarkable thing is that the rule of these non-Han dynasties over the Chinese empire did not lead to breakup of empire or abandonment of existing imperial institutions. On the contrary ways, the empire was relatively strong and stable under the Mongol and Manchu king dynasties. What was the social and economic change at that time? What the socially change and the economically change they had seen at that time? From aristocracy to gentry means the aristocrat people were known as the wealthiest people of that particular area. Aristocracy to the gentry. In an effort to considerate his rule, the first king emperor had sought to deal a mortal blow to the powerful aristocratic families that could have challenged him. He also sought to establish a direct relationship between the state and the mass of peasant taxpayers. However, under the Han rulers in subsequent centuries, aristocratic elite comprised of large landed families commanded political and military power once again revived. This class was badly hit by the bloody wars accompanying the end of Tang dynasty and in subsequent half century of civil war in 10th century CE. Another blow to its power was the success of later emperors in centralizing military power in their own hands. From about 1000 CE, this became the main channel of entering officialdom. What this meant was that a much larger elite stratum based on land and commercial wealth, which enabled their son to acquire education, could enter the highest levels of officialdom and acquire power. Next is the ethnic and the cultural diversity. The penetration of Buddhism, a foreign religion, into China, and the wave of nomadic incursions that occurred in centuries after the breakup of Han Empire led to the development of a society that was far more mixed and complex than earlier. Trade and social connections, including intermarriage between Chinese and non Chinese, particularly in the north, increased tremendously. The era of great Tang dynasty was a period of great cosmopolitanism and openness to foreign influences and foreign trade. Next is growing commercialization of economy. How they commercialized their economy at that time. The Song period in China. That was Song period in China. They saw remarkable economic growth and the development of interregional commerce. The earlier pattern of peasant in producing mainly for their own subsistence and in order to pay rent to landlords started to change and the peasantry increasing began to produce for the market. The years of disunion and invasion in the north had triggered great waves of migration and settlement of the more fertile center and southern regions of China. The abundance of water and favorable climate there, the introduction of new early ripening varieties of rice led to a great increase in agricultural productivity. Certain areas began to specialize in specific crops just like cotton, tea, which were produced entirely for the market. The growing interregional commerce led to the increasing importance of money and to experiments with new forms of currency, including the world's earliest paper currency. Economic growth, in turn, led to the expansion of market towns and urban centers, and the emergence of great commercial cities just like Kaifeng and Suzhou, as opposed to great administrative capital cities of earlier times. The growing prosperity among certain classes and strata led to the spread of literacy, aided by the invention of woodblock printing. Next, the condition of population growth. The increase in, yes, for China, if we are talking about China, we are studying about the history of China, and we need to study about the population growth in China. Yes, that is very compulsory for all of you. The increase in agricultural productivity also was the basis for a tremendous increase in population in the last few centuries of imperial China. It has been estimated that while the population of China stood around 100 million in 1000 CE, by the early 17th century, this had increased to 260 million. And under the Qing dynasty, the population again doubled to about 500 million. 500 million. This led to tremendous pressure on land. Yes, Chinese society followed the system of parceling out land equally among sons in a family, greatly reducing a family's land holdings over time. And under these circumstances, many peasants chose to abandon their lands, which could no longer sustain them. These were then often acquired by landlords, leading to increasing land concentration, particularly in the more fertile regions. Many of the landless peasants either turned to tenant farming or non agricultural occupations to sustain themselves or moved to less populated and less fertile areas to eke out living. The many centuries of economic growth and relatively stable political conditions had brought China to a level that was in many ways more advanced than other parts of the world, including Europe on the eve of industrial revolution. The condition of Qing dynasty. If we are studying the Chinese history, then we need to study about the Qing dynasty. What was the condition and who was the ruler of the Qing dynasty at that time? As we have noted earlier, it has been customary to view the king primarily through the prism of failure. As the dynasty responsible for humiliation of China at the hands of the West and for the collapse of imperial order. But few periods of Chinese history have gone through such a major resentment in many years as the Qing period. China had reached a height in terms of size, in terms of power, in terms of prosperity at the time of Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was founded by a non Han people from the region called Manchuria, northeast of Great Wall, who overthrew the last pure Chinese dynasty. Last pure Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty in 1644. Much has been written about how successfully these foreign emperors ruled as Confucian monarchs and successfully co opted the Chinese elite into serving them after an initial period of resistance. Equally important is that the Manchu rulers used a variety of methods to vast territories into the Chinese Empire that had not been part of it before, including parts of Mongolia, Chinese Turkestan, Tibet, parts of deep southwest. The king developed an administrative system that could be viewed as the most effective of its time anywhere in the world for the governing of such a vast and heterogeneous territory. The three king emperors who ruled in succession from 1660s to the end of 18th century were in addition particularly able and hardworking rulers who kept a close watch on the pulse of what was happening in different parts of empire. A major problem was that the officialdom was not expanded to meet the needs of a rapidly growing population and economy, nor were the salaries of officials correspondingly raised. This led to decreasing central oversight of what was happening in the provinces and growing administrative inefficiency, corruption, and demoralization at that time. Another problem was that the king, who used their military forces so effectively to conquer China and peripheral territories in the early decades, were more concerned afterwards with preventing the military establishment from becoming a threat to their own rule. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to say that the king government and elite had become incapable of responding to major challenges and taking major initiatives in the last century of their rule. The great opium debate initiated by the emperor in 1830, summoned his officials to devise a solution to the opium problem. The systematic efforts taken by officials and scholars to try and understand the changing world order and the West in particular, and decisive stamp out of great mid 19th century revolts by the king and scholar gentry all indicate that the imperial order presided over the king did not collapse easily. Next is the China and the world before the 19th century. Before 19th century, what was the condition of China in the world? If we are talking about. In this last section, we will consider some aspects of China's relation with the rest of the world before 19th century. Yes, next is Sinocentrism, Zongo and Tianxia. We have seen at the beginning of this unit, Zhonggu, the name for China, was the term first used to refer to the central states in China during the Zhou period. However, Zhonggu can also be translated as Middle Kingdom, and this has been used to argue that the Chinese thought of themselves as the center of the world and that they looked down on everyone else. Next is the tribute system. What are the tribute system? Tribute under the influence of John King, Fairbank, Fairbank and American sinology, it became common to use the term tribute system as overarching framework to describe pre-19th century China's external relations. According to this concept, China maintained relations only with those states and peoples which presented tribute to the Chinese emperor. Tribute to Chinese emperor and thereby accepted the superiority of the Chinese emperor. In return, it was posited the Chinese emperor would send back valuable gift and also allow the visitors to trade, which was the motivation for foreigners to participate in this ritual. The implication here is one of Chinese exceptionalism. In other words, the idea that China did not conduct its foreign relations on the basis of usual calculations of self interest and profit, but mainly from concern with its own prestige. Many scholars, however, now reject the validity of tribute system as a description of China's external relation on various grounds. Next is the hostility of king to free trade. The argument that the king was opposed to free trade was central to Western justifications for the Opium Wars and unequal treaty system that was thereafter imposed on China in 19th century. As is now well known and understood from about 1500, China was a major participant in a globalized commerce and, among other things, saw Chinese tea, porcelain, silk flowing in increasing quantities all over the world, and silver from the Americas pouring into China. It is true that some of the Ming rulers sought to regulate and monopolize the trade from the Chinese side. Even though this policy did not last long, later Ming rulers officially maintained a ban on private trade with other centuries, except Japan. However, the Qing, after they had consolidated their rule over China, lifted the ban in 1684, and foreign traders from all countries, all centuries were welcome to trade. Yes, now in this unit 1, what we have studied about? We have learned about the sum of main stages in evolution of Chinese society, polity, culture, and economy. We have studied about the scholarly understanding of China's past. We have studied about the Qing dynasty and the Chinese civilization and what was the condition of the aristocrats at that time. Chinese empire had over many centuries repeatedly expanded and contracted in size. That China had extensive contact with the world outside and sustained trading relations with several regions. We have studied in this unit 1. Now in unit 2 we are going to study about the opium wars in China. That was very important. That is very important topic. The opium wars. They fought war on behalf of opium. What was the objectives of this unit 2? To learn about the background to the main events of opium wars, and we explain the nature of Chinese response to Western presence in China in this period. And in opium wars represented the first major armed confrontation between China and modern West. But more than that, they were a watershed in Chinese history. They set off a chain of developments in China's relation with the West, and which the Western powers used their superiority, military strength to wrest concession after concession from the Chinese empire and consolidate and expand their own interest there. What was the background? To have a proper understanding of the opium wars, we must look at their historical background. Some features of traditional Chinese foreign relation. Chinese foreign relation with other countries. In unit 1 of this course, we have studied about the traditional Chinese worldview, external relation of Chinese empire, we have studied. And now in this unit 2, the traditional of Chinese system of foreign relations was molded by two important factors. One of these was the preeminent position of Chinese empire in East Asia and overwhelmingly size, wealth, power, high cultural level, and basic self-sufficiency in most material values. And the other factor was the ever present military threat from nomadic and semi nomadic peoples on China's northern and western borders. These two factors in combination gave rise to certain apparently contradictory features in traditional Chinese external relation and world outlook. In the course of its more than 2000 years of history, the relations of Chinese empire with other countries went through many vicissitudes. There were long periods of peaceful economic, cultural, political relations in which the Chinese empire faced no major external threat or challenge to its supremacy in the region. There were also repeated raids and incursions by military powerful neighboring people, which sometimes resulted in their conquest of all or part of China. Traditional Chinese political theory did not recognize a strict distinction between domestic affairs and external relations as we understand it today. The Emperor of China was considered the ruler of all under heaven. Therefore, the external boundaries of Chinese empire were not clearly defined. uh, inhabited in this empire, where even in the theory it was accepted that the fringe of the empire were inhabited by so-called people barbarian people who did not follow the same culture or social patterns as the Chinese themselves and who had their own rulers and systems of government. Much has been said about this term barbarian. It has been greatly misunderstood. and interpreted by scholars and officials of modern West to be a form of slender and even hostility towards non-Chinese people. While Chinese recognize the need to devise ways to deal with these alien people, the initiative to have relations with Chinese empire usually came from those people rather than from the Chinese empire itself. In general, various foreign people and the envoys of various states came to China for the purpose of trade, for cultural or religious purpose, or to seek political recognition or legitimacy from the Emperor of China. The point being made here is that the Chinese Empire followed a wide variety of norms and practices for dealing with the different peoples and states with which it interacted. However, mainly because of the writings of Western observers and writings of scholars from 19th century onwards, the traditional Chinese system of foreign relations has been portrayed as a very rigid system, mainly identified with two features. Identified with two features, which were the two features, the presentation of tribute and koto. Tribute was a term of Chinese used to describe the gift presented to the emperor by official foreign delegations, while koto was the ceremonial prostration. Yes, ceremonial prostration they were expected to perform in front of the emperor. These two features they presented over there when they entered to the empire of that particular area. It is true that both tribute and koto were designed to emphasize the superiority of Emperor of China and that this superiority was not acceptable to most Western powers and their envoys. The Chinese does not insist that all foreigners who came to China must present tribute or perform the koto, but only insist on it from those envoys who wanted to be received by Emperor himself. They did not make it a precondition for all those who wanted to engage in trade or other activities. The treatment of Arabs who conducted lucrative trade at Canton for centuries, as well as for of the Russians who resided in Peking from the 17th century, as example of flexibility of Chinese in such matters. Next, we are going to read this topic 2.2 that was early contact between China and West and Canton system. In 1842, 1978, this is the time period when we are talking about a seagoing trade between China and Europe. China and Europe had been conducted ever since the Portuguese arrived off the South China coast in the early 1500s. A full century later, a Portuguese who joined by the British and the Dutch, who were both emerging as a major maritime powers. British trade with China was a monopoly of East India Company. Have you heard about East India Company? Yes, we have discussed earlier. The period from the mid 17th to mid 18th century saw many ups and downs in the fortunes of this seagoing trade. Yes, in the first place, this was related to domestic political developments with China. In 1644, the Ming dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, was overthrown, and the forces of Manchus, a non Chinese people from beyond the northeastern borders, swept over North China. The Manchus that succeeded in setting up their own dynasty, the king with its capital at Peking, very rapidly. But it took nearly 2 decades of bloody civil war to establish their complete supremacy over the whole of China. Since the main center of resistance to the new rulers lay in coastal provinces of South and Central China and in the island of Taiwan, it was not unnatural that coastal trade was severely disrupted in this period. In fact, the Manchus took the extraordinary step of evacuating the entire population among a 25-kilometer wide belt of south central coast for an 8-year period from 1661 to 1669. However, this did not mean that the king rulers were hostile to a controlled trade and other relation with the Europeans. Several ports were open to trade with the foreigners. Under the region of Kangxi Emperor, the Europeans, the particular the Jesuits, were welcomed. However, following a bitter controversy with the Pope at Rome in 1718, the attitude of King government towards the Europeans changed dramatically. They were evicted from even the port of Canton, where they had been residing in great numbers. They were allowed to carry on trading, but were allowed to reside thereafter only at the island of Macau. The efforts of certain British the efforts of certain British traders and adventurers like Commodore Anderson and James Flint to challenge these limitations by show to a force did not help matters at all. The King government reacted sharply to such evidence of troublemaking on a part of the foreigners and in 1757 closed all ports to foreign trade except for the port of Canton. That's why came to be established the Canton system, which was to be the only recognized form of commercial intercourse between China and West until the Opium Wars. Next is we are going to study about much has been written about the restrictive nature of Canton system. Yes, number one, about the limitations on the freedom of movement and activities of the foreign traders. Next is about the harshness of tax and fee imposed on foreign charges. Next, about the extent of corruption and so on. But it's very important to view these complaints in their proper perspective. Although Canton was the only port open to foreign trade, it was nevertheless a well developed port with all the infrastructure and facilities necessary for the conduct of the trade and with good lines of supply and communication with the interior. The Opium War 2.3 point is the opium trade. Opium, a narcotic substance. Narcotic substance derived from the poppy flower was known to Chinese from the late 7th or early 8th century when it was introduced by the Arabs and the Turks. Initially used mainly as a medicine, pain reliever, opium smoking for pleasure began to spread among the Chinese from 17th century. This kind of opium intake used to lead to a rapid deterioration in the physical and mental condition of those who indulged in it. Opium smoking was highly addictive, and those addicts who were deprived of opium for even a short period of time used to undergo real torment. They would become nauseous and restless, suffer from aches, muscle twitches, chills, hot flashes, insomnia, and so on. They faced all these problems. As the opium habit spread among the people, the imperial government was forced to sit up and take note. In 1729, the sale and the smoking of opium was prohibited, while in 1796, its importation and cultivation also were prohibited. Despite these prohibitions, the import of opium into China grew rapidly in the late 18th and especially in the early years of 19th century. While in 1729 the annual importation of opium was 200 chests, in 1765-67 it was 1000 chests, 200 to 1000 chests. Between 1800 and 1820, this amount rose to 4500 chests, and between 1820 to 1830 to over 10,000 chests. Over 10,000. In 1838 to 1839, just before the outbreak of hostilities between China and Britain, it reached the stupendous figure of 40,000 chests. In this period, it has been estimated that there were as many as 10 million Chinese addicts of drug, accounting for 10 to 20% of central government officials. 20 to 30% of local government officials, and a large proportion of Manchu military forces. This was a condition of opium, and the leading imports of opium into China were the British. But the British opium trade was conducted in a peculiar, convoluted manner. The opium was grown in India, and the entire process of cultivating and processing was a monopoly of British East India Company. Because of Chinese official prohibition on import of opium, the East India Company did not want to be directly associated with the import of opium into China for the fear that this would jeopardize its overall trade with China. Therefore, opium was carried to China from India by private traders. Private traders are also known as country traders. And for the license of opium trade operating under a license from the East India Company, a sophisticated network of Chinese and foreign smugglers, their collaborators, ensured that the opium was distributed in China. There is no doubt that the illegal opium trade could not have flourished as it did without significant local collaboration in China. Naval forces, naval customs, and the service, on the one hand, facilitated the task of smugglers, making it possible for them to violate the prohibitions on the opium trade with impunity. But on the other hand, if we are talking about, on the other hand, there was active collaboration as well. A whole network of people ranging from boatmen, coolies to prosperous bankers and opium den workers, owners, profited immensely from the trade and had a vested interest in keeping it going. But even more important was the collaboration of officials at various levels who turned a blind eye to what was going on or who assisted in even more direct ways in return for a share of the profit. By the 1830s, the imperial government was seriously alarmed over the uncontrolled growth of opium trade and its harmful consequences. Among the emperor and his high officials, there was serious discussion on how to handle this growing menace. This culminated in the Great Opium Debate of 1838 to 1839, in which the emperor sought advice from all governor generals of empire as well as other high officials also. Although the idea of legalizing the opium trade as a way to regain some degree of control over it, that was briefly considered. Ultimately, the opinion that prevailed was that the ban on opium must be strictly enforced. The noted official Lin Zheju was dispatched to Canton as imperial commissioner with a specific mandate to put a stop to the opium trade. The stage was thereby set for a direct confrontation between the King government and Western powers. In our next class, we will study about the first Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking. Okay, that is very important for all of you. Opium wars that will come into your exam, and you will have to prepare about the opium wars. The first opium war, we will study about what was the consequences and the Chinese response to the Western presence. We will study about the Chinese response to Western presence. What was the response of Chinese? And what were the official policies they were making at that time with the help of King Dynasty? Which policies and what were the popular Chinese resistance? How they resist in making opium and how they fought opium war at that time. That was the first opium war. Now we after that we will study about the second opium war and the treaty of Tanzin. Okay, the Treaty of Tansin. That is a very different name. You also have heard about in this book, in this name. Next, conflict interpretations of opium wars. We will study about in these opium wars and what were the conflicting interpretation of these opium wars. Opium War 1 and Opium War 2 and the consequences of these. Yes, these two wars, opium wars, were very important, are very important, and these question will come into exams definitely, and you will have to prepare these opium wars in your exam. That is very important. The condition of China, we have studied about the economical, social, political condition. What was the condition of these type of Chinese, and we have studied about a lot. The first Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking. The first Opium War was held in. First factor was the vigorous growth of opium, smuggling outside the bounds of this system. They were doing at that time. The second factor was the ending of East India Company's monopoly of British trade with China in 1834. Okay, before 1834, they have connected with China, but in 1834, the ending of East India Company's monopoly of British trade with China. Next is the resultant problem of how the King government was to deal with new situation, how they were doing the important changes at that time. When the King government was informed about the impending end of East India Company monopoly, it requested that the new British manager or Tebben be appointed to oversee that activities the British that oversee the activities of the British traders so that he or she can see the activities that were holding at that time. The superintendents of trade who were appointed by British government and sent to China, beginning with Lord Napier, were not traders but representatives of British government who were not reconciled to being dealt with as mere merchants. That's why the period from 1834 to 1839 New, they saw constant friction between these British officials and king authorities, as the former sought to deal directly with king officials on equal terms, just like Napier in a very brilliant manner, and others, just like J.F. Davis, Captain C. Elliot, in more peaceable fashion. Although this tension did not directly lead to hostilities, but it had its own fallout. What was the fallout of this time period? Firstly, it led to increased irritation and suspicion on both sides, including the consolidation of hard time. Factions advocating strong action against each other, both among the king officials as well as among British traders and officials. Secondly, on more than one occasion, British warships were sent to Chinese waters. They tested the vigilance and preparedness to fight of king authorities. Yes, we are going to sum up this. Now we are going to end this class and we will meet in our next class with the opium wars that they held in China. Thank you. Have a nice day.